Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Two Way. This is Two Way tonight. Very grateful to you for joining. This is our platform for conversations about all sorts of things. We're going to do an episode tonight where I'll do a quick newscast, tell you what's going on, and then we're going to hold on. We're going to deal with some technical difficulties, and then we're going to be joined by Scott Bessent, who's an advisor to Donald Trump, and we'll take your questions. Before we do those two things, though, I just want to talk about the platform. As always, if you're watching on YouTube, welcome in. Our audience grows daily, so there's some new people here. Thank you for joining. Thank you if you're here on the Two Way platform on Zoom, be able to ask questions. This is not a normal political platform as compared to a lot of things that are out there. If you want to just hear things that are positive about Red America, watch Sean Hannity. If you just want to hear positive things about Blue America, watch Rachel Maddow. This platform's different. Last night, we had on Celinda Lake, a great Democratic pollster. No matter what party you're in, you can learn from Celinda. Very experienced, very knowledgeable. You may not agree with everything she says, and you may think sometimes she's spinning a little bit, but you can learn from her. And then we had some folks on who were supporters of Kamala Harris, just by the luck of the draw. I called on people I didn't know who they supported. They turned out to be Harris supporters. I heard from a ton of people on social media, directly to me, on this platform, on the chat. Horrible, never watch again. I used to like the platform, now it's horrible. That's what this platform is about. If one night you happen to hear a lot from the left, use it as an opportunity to learn. If your attitude is you'll never watch the platform again, I guess goodbye. You're not here for the right reasons. But we could have 5 straight nights of hearing about the left, and it'll be educational. It'll be a different kind of conversation. We call them conversations like no other. Tonight, we have on an economic policy advisor to President Trump, Scott Bessent. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Scott. I bet some of you are not. Incredible opportunity to learn about someone who's very influential, with the person who right now is the most likely, maybe the second most likely, but probably the most likely person to be president. You may not agree with what Scott says. You may detest Scott simply because he's close to Donald Trump. But use this as an opportunity to learn. Presumption of grace for all. I'm so proud of the conversations we have here and what we've built already. And I wish more people who come on the platform would be in the spirit of the platform. If you'd like to be on, have a conversation, get a question to Scott, please raise your electronic hand. We want people who are Harris supporters, Trump supporters, people interested in the economy. He knows a lot about the American economy. It's a great opportunity to learn. So again, if you want to be in the conversation, please raise your hand. Okay? Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern time, morning meeting. And then at 6 o'clock tomorrow Eastern time, back to our regular time, another Republican, just because the way booking works, Paul Manafort will be here, who was very instrumental in Donald Trump's victory in 2016. He'll be here to talk about what he thinks going on in the presidential race. So please come for that as well. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have events tonight. Kamala Harris, 7:30 Eastern time on the Ellipse. They put out some excerpts of her speech. As you know, it was originally cast as, or at least thought of, as a speech primarily focusing on democracy, January 6th, etc. It's a broader speech, and it will deal with lots of different themes. The core themes of her campaign, we've talked about reproductive freedom, the economy, and then her critique of President Trump as being concerned with himself and not with the American people. She also did, in advance of the speech, something people thought she would do more of. She taped television interviews with local stations, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Spanish language radio in Pennsylvania. So we'll look for those and maybe have them on the morning meeting. President Trump has his event in Pennsylvania tonight. He did a press event. It was not a press conference today, with a focus on immigration and families affected by illegal acts by illegal immigrants in this country, as well as extremely touching testimonial from a woman who lost her daughter-in-law in Afghanistan. The event was the press obsessed with the Madison Square Garden. President Trump addressed that, but he didn't address it to the press's satisfaction. So that will keep going. Also tonight, 8 o'clock, J.D. Vance is doing a town hall on Newsmax. So there are 3 events coming up this evening. Lots of polls coming out and lots of new ads coming out that are, some are legit, but some are not. Or in the case of the ads, they're of shadowy provenance. So we don't have the time to show you all of them. Some of them are quite striking. Some of them are actually have money behind them, and they're going on television. And some of them are from known groups, some unknowns. This main super PAC supporting Kamala Harris put out a bunch of new ads today and said they were going to spend like $100 million in a week on them in the battleground states. Some of them are what I call video press releases. They are provocative, and they're intended to get coverage or to incite people or suppress the vote on social media. The Daisy ad, the most famous political ad in American history, aired once. It only aired once, and it was a video press release, but it's thought of as an ad. Call it a video press release because they put it out to attempt to get coverage. And in the age of social media, they don't need to get coverage in the New York Times or on CBS News. They can just be retweeted and passed around. So lots of those. Fake polls are intended to create momentum or whatever. CNN had 2 polls. We can put those up today. They polled Arizona and they polled Nevada, and groundbreaking, 2 more ties. 48-47, Harris ahead in Arizona, Trump ahead 48-47, meaningless, all within the margin of error. No one's ahead in the public polling in those races. Supreme Court was asked to rule, you can take the poll down. Supreme Court was asked to rule whether Bobby Kennedy wanted to be taken off the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan. Supreme Court said no, they weren't going to take him off. Remains a complexity. The Trump campaign and Bobby Kennedy doesn't want anybody to vote for him in those states, but he's on the ballot, and that could make the difference. Donald Trump could lose those states by votes that go to the gap that goes to Bobby Kennedy. So that's another thing to keep watching. And concerns in Pennsylvania and Arizona about what I call casting and counting. The states are all trying to warn the public in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona. This could take a long time. Don't expect results on election night. I think some of the public is getting that message, some is not. One person who's gotten that message is Steve Bannon. An hour and a half ago or 2 hours ago, I was across town here in Gotham City where Steve Bannon held a press conference on the day he got out of prison. A lot of the questions from the press were about January 6th and about protesting the results. And Steve Bannon was quite thoughtful in saying the Secretary of State of Michigan has said it's going to take them a while to count the votes, and suggested that although he didn't love all the legal changes that had occurred since the last election, that he was generally pleased, and suggested, while he wanted President Trump to come out on election night and announce sort of what he thought the vote tallies were, excuse me, where the outstanding vote is, that he seemed to suggest he thought patience was going to be the order of the day. I hope he sticks with that, because that would be great, because we may well need some patience. That's some of what's going on. Obviously, every day between now and election day, there'll be a lot, but we'll stop there in terms of what I know about what's going on and bring in Scott Bessent. He's an economic advisor to President Trump. I'll talk to Scott for a little bit, and then we're going to want your questions again on the economy, on the campaign related to the economy. We'll get to a lot of you. So if you want to ask Scott a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. So I'm going to bring Scott in now. And Scott, thank you for joining here. Grateful to you. First question is, how did you become an economic policy advisor to President Trump?
Sure. I've known the Trump family for about 30 years. I was good friends with his brother, Robert, who passed away when he was in office. And I made the judgment in spring of 23 that Donald Trump was going to win the Republican nomination and become the next president of the United States. And I was almost using some analysis from the investment business. In the investment business, there's something called a stock that goes up on bad news. So Microsoft, the Justice Department investigates them, the stock goes up. Google reports bad earnings, the stock goes up. And there's this strategy of lawfare against President Trump. And I think a lot of my Republican colleagues and supporters were terrified of this. Well, there's this many lawsuits, they're going to get him on one of them. And it's kind of like the scene with Obi-Wan and Darth in Star Wars, where he says, well, every time you try to kill me, it makes me stronger. And so I went down, arranged a meeting, went down, and started talking to President Trump about the economy. And the situation that we were in now, what the situation might look like over the next few years, what policies had worked quite well in Trump 1.0, what policies in Trump 2.0 should be, given the changing landscape, and what would work for the new Republican coalition. And I've come out from behind my desk really for three reasons. One, I think given this explosion in debt that we've seen, and make no mistake about it, this is a spending problem. The United States does not have a revenue problem. The Biden administration has blown the doors off on spending. This is the most spending we've ever had when we don't have a war, we don't have a recession. Normally, I'm going to geek out here for a minute. Normally, the federal government takes in about 17.5 to 19% of GDP in revenues. For the past 40 years, we've had about a 3.5% budget deficit. So that means we spent about 21, 22. Now we're at 25. And this is something that we've never seen before. And if we don't get this under control, it will be impossible to draw our way out of this. And we're going to go into kind of a European style malaise spiral where you're in this bad equilibrium. You have to raise taxes. The deficit's higher. You have to raise taxes. It kills growth. Rinse and repeat. Secondly, I think that we are on the verge. This is the 80th anniversary of Bretton Woods, and I think we are on the verge of a major international realignment that's necessary, both trade, currency, defense, values. And I've taught economic history at Yale. I have been in the markets meeting with government leaders for 35 years. And I'd like to be part of that realignment, either from the inside or from the outside. And then three, Mark, I can't remember when you published it, but your headline, maybe in the past 5 days, basically saying if Donald Trump wins, it will be because it was a multiracial working class backlash against what has happened to the bottom 50% or working class Americans. And Donald Trump has formed a working class party here. And I want to see that the new constituents are well taken care of and that working class majority keeps expanding.
We're so glad and grateful to you. I'm so glad you're here and so grateful to you for making time. You raised a bunch of stuff I want to get to. I still want people to know you a little better. So did you grow up rich, poor, middle class? What circumstances did you grow up in?
Rich, then poor. So
rich, then poor.
So our family, we were early days in South Carolina. We'd been rich for 250 years. My dad decided it'd be a good idea to be a leveraged real estate investor. So we started out very affluent. I ended up having to get my first job when I was 9 years old. Worked 3 jobs to put myself through Yale. And so I've known economic anxiety, and now I've had good fortune in the markets and have a degree of comfort again.
What does Key Square Capital Management do?
Key Square does a variety of things. We are primarily what is called a macro hedge fund. So I worked for George Soros or Soros Fund Management for most of my career. My mentor, Stan Druckenmiller, who some of you may know, and we trade currencies, bonds, commodities, equities, credit, and we try to analyze economic data and predict where asset prices are going to go.
So you've been involved in spending time with President Trump and his other economic advisors and political team when he's given major economic addresses. So you're quite aware of the Trump agenda, what's been talked about. I want to put aside the campaign for a second and ask you, again, not a critique of the Biden-Harris administration, but the kind of longer term past and present and future. What are the fundamental strengths and then weaknesses of the American economy right now?
Yeah, so I think we have to reprivatize the economy, and I think we've had kind of a return to central planning in terms of the government is squeezing out, and so I have financial views, I have political views. I'll give you financial views now.
Yeah.
So we have seen an expansion of government spending, and so if we take the past year, non-government adjacent jobs, meaning healthcare, we've only created 250,000 jobs. And majority of those have gone to non-Americans, whatever you want to call them, illegal aliens, new arrivals. We've spent all this money on the CHIPS Act, on the IRA, and we created 18,000 manufacturing jobs. So I think that we are in and this again is an investment view. I think that we are in an emerging style election year equilibrium that is quite precarious, because what's happened, everyone in this call presumably is in the top 10, 20% of the wage earners.
I hope not.
Sorry?
I hope not. I hope we have some
Well,
people who aren't in that top 20%. But
okay, well, I doubt we have anyone in the bottom 2 quintiles.
okay.
And what we've seen is that, and the Fed just published a study on this, we've seen asset inflation, which is typical in an EM style election year. So government creates asset inflation, the wealth effect, we spend because we're highly confident our houses are higher, equity prices are higher. The top 20% of Americans consume about 50%, are responsible for about 50% of all consumption. So, a good framing for this might be, this was a record year for Americans to go to Europe. Also, at 4.1% unemployment, we have record food bank usage. So we are just, it is a bifurcated economy. And I think that's likely unsustainable, that we've seen negative over the past 3.5 years. We've seen about negative 2.5% wage growth based on government statistics. The bottom 2 quintiles have a different basket of goods and services than you and I. They've probably seen negative 10% loss in purchasing power. So the aggregate numbers look quite good, but China has very good aggregate numbers. They don't really care what's going on under the hood. So I think we're in this kind of unsustainable equilibrium here.
If you just think then about the private sector, forget the government spending, the government's role, what are the current strengths of the American private sector as compared to our competitors?
Oh, it's 100%, it's innovation. Right? It is, we are the envy of the world. Silicon Valley, our tech sector, there is nothing like it. I think Europe has one of the 50 largest tech companies in the world. China has a few. So it's really this innovation economy, but that's part of the winner-take-all society, and that tends to accrue to the top 10 or 20%, and we tend to save, not spend.
If you look at the Chinese government, what is their strategy to beat the United States economically, would you say? What are the hallmarks of their strategy to beat us?
I don't think they have a strategy anymore. I think that their strategy up until Xi Jinping was this incredible dynamism between, I can't remember what they called it, capitalism with communist tendencies or communism with capitalist traits. And Xi Jinping has kind of exploded that model. Now they are focused on the military, civil, industrial complex, and military is always first. I can't remember what the phrase is in Mandarin. They are the most unbalanced economy in the history of the world in terms of, I'm cuffing the numbers, but I'm right on order of magnitude, but I'll give you three numbers. So think 12%, 22%, and 35%. So 12% of the population, 22% of the GDP, but 35% of the exports. So they are attempting to export their way out of the malaise they have. They have a terrible real estate problem, worse than anything we had in 08, worse than Spain had. And it is gigantic. So they really are just trying to get ahead in AI, in quantum, and in payments.
Yeah. If you think about, say, the last 100 years, who's someone who's been Treasury Secretary who you thought did a good job?
Well, probably one of the most important Treasury secretaries was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Samuel Chase, because he financed the war, and it's really one of the reasons the North won. James Baker was a fantastic Treasury Secretary, and Bob Rubin, funny enough, did a great job in office, and then he did a lousy job when he was vice chairman of Citibank.
When Bob Rubin was Treasury Secretary, what did he do well?
I'm old enough to remember, I know you are, Mark, maybe a lot of the people on this call are, he used the bond market as a cudgel to beat down excess spending. So it was always the battle of the two Bobs. Bob Reich, who was labor secretary, Bob Rubin, and Bob Rubin was very good. He started out as NEC chair, then he became treasury, and he really tutored Bill Clinton on how to think about the economy. And whenever the spending bills or whenever he thought that there was too much intervention in the labor markets, he'd say, you can do that, but the bond market vigilantes are gonna revolt. And Bob Reich famously said, in my next life, I want to come back as the bond market because it seems to control the US government. And then he resigned.
Right. I'm going to have a few more questions for Scott, and then it's going to be your turn. So please raise your hand if you'd like to get in, and we'll get to a lot of you. Same question about last 100 years, Fed chair. Who's someone who was Fed chair who you thought did a good job and why?
Paul Volcker, tough medicine. He went to Reagan and said, look, you're going to get murdered in 82 in the midterms. And in fairness, Reagan stood by him. It was a wipeout. And then Reagan won 49 states in 84.
You've had a lot of time, as I said before, with President Trump talking about the economy. I've had some, and I know that certain aspects of the liberal and establishment critique of President Trump and his understanding of and thoughts about the economy are wrong. And I know you've got more insight to it than that. So how would you say, as a thinker and as a policy formulator, how would you say he's misunderstood by the establishments of both parties?
Yeah, look, he's just very sophisticated in terms of he understands finance, he understands the Fed. I will take a cheap shot here. I'm not sure Vice President Harris, certainly not Governor Walz, could explain the difference between the Fed and Treasury and what their functions are. But the downside is he also wants his opinion heard on the Fed. But not unlike Bill Clinton, President Trump will respond to market pressure. And I think the biggest misunderstanding is that somehow these tariffs, this tax, this regulation, he will respond to, well, if you do that, then the market will do this. I think it's very Clinton-esque in that way. And I think the other thing he understands is deregulation, because the Biden administration, my theory of the case on inflation, it didn't have to be as bad as it was. These two spending bills where Vice President Harris cast the deciding vote, the American Rescue Plan, the kind of Orwellian named Inflation Reduction Act, they caused a demand shock that was met by supply constraint in the form of 100,000 new pages in the Federal Register. Under Donald Trump, you got a demand shock from the tax cut, but they cut regulation. So supply and demand were more in equilibrium, and you ended up with something that was like a 2% inflation rate. So the one thing President Trump does understand is that this deregulation can really loosen or unleash a lot of the power of the economy.
You've mentioned the debt and the deficit several times. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. The Washington Post was my hometown paper. I used to read op-ed piece after op-ed piece saying we have to cut the debt and deficit because it'll destroy the country. It doesn't seem to have destroyed the country. President Trump, even before COVID, showed very little commitment to restraining spending. The only way to restrain spending is through dealing with the entitlement programs. That's where the money is. He's made it clear he's not interested in doing that. And in this campaign, I listened to a lot of his speeches. He didn't really talk about the debt and deficit, and certainly doesn't offer solutions. So how do you square your concerns with his apparent lack of concern, both as a president and as a candidate?
Well, I'm going to push back a little. In Trump 1.0, the debt to GDP went down. So the deficits were, the government revenues never went down. Government revenues actually went up with the tax cuts. Then we had COVID, and now—
Hold on, I stopped you. I apologize to interrupt. Before COVID, he did nothing to restrain the programs that account for the problem that we have. He did not do anything to restrain the growth of Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security, and he wasn't for cutting the defense budget. Discretionary spending, domestic discretionary spending, has nothing to do with the ability to control the debt and deficit. So he didn't address those programs, and he's not addressing them now as a candidate.
Yeah, well, what I can tell you now, and he and I had a long discussion a couple of months ago, the problem now that we are at 7% deficit to GDP is that you've got to address that before you can address entitlement reform. So my advice to him has been to try to get deficit to GDP something that has a 3 in front of it, which would be cutting it in half by 2028. If you go back and look, why did Emmanuel Macron get bounced from office? Or he wasn't bounced from office, but why did he lose parliamentary majority? France has the second lowest retirement age in Europe. He wanted to raise it from 62 to 64, and his coalition partner got cold feet at the last minute. They lost the vote, the government fell, and then Mélenchon, who is far left, campaigned on, oh no, we're not going to 64. We actually need to come to 60, which would tie them with Ukraine for the lowest retirement age. So touching these entitlements is a third rail, but the only way to start the long-term reform is to get the short-term in order.
All right, next time go ahead.
No, I was going to say, look, there are a lot of campaign promises. There are a lot of ideas being floated around. I do Zoom several times a week or meet in person. In the Republican caucus, especially in the House, there is a big appetite for pay-fors.
Yeah. When you come back, whether it's whoever wins the election, whatever, I want to talk at length about Social Security, because it seems to me the fixes are all easy and they should be done. But I want to talk one more question, and then we're going to go to the community here. I've been called hopelessly naive by leading economists in both parties for saying we should aspire to growth at 3% of GDP or higher. That those who are defeatists and say it's just not possible, I think are wrong. The only way to deal with the debt and the deficit is robust economic growth and fair revenue increases as sensible that won't hurt the economy. That's the combination that reduces the deficit and the debt. So do you believe the U.S. economy can grow on a sustained basis at 3% and above, or is that naive?
You're not naive. And look, take me out of the question. The closest advisors to President Trump, Larry Kudlow, Steve Moore, Art Laffer, all believe that. And
Yeah.
but I do think that now is the last opportunity to try to do the moon, I'll call that moonshot growth. Because I used to, I have a day job, but before I got involved in the political world, and shame on me because I've been studying budgets and geopolitics as part of our investing process. I didn't realize the way the CBO scoring worked. And the CBO scoring, as you point out, is just baseline 1.8% forever.
Right.
And so when you read, like Trump's going to be 7.5 trillion, Harris is going to be 3.5, whatever it is, 4.5. It's static scoring. And oh wait, just 1 second, I got to plug my thing in. It's static scoring, so it's the same scoring if you cut taxes or if you raise taxes. And I think if we use the baseline 1.8, it's very easy to get another 60 or 80 basis points through deregulation. And once you get the deregulation, then you get animal spirits. And if you don't have to get the deficit down immediately, but if you can get interest rates down, inflation back to target, and just start talking a good game about getting the deficit down, then you can they grow at 3% or more, and 3% or more changes all the trajectory. That trajectory changes the debt dynamics forever.
Yep, absolutely. I believe that, and I hope whoever wins the election believes that too. All right, Dan Verney, welcome in. Tell folks where you are if you'd like to. Tell them who you're supporting for president and what's on your mind for Scott.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks, Mark. I am based in the greater Washington, D.C. area. I run a strategic planning and market research consultancy for trade associations. And in terms of background, Scott, what I want to share with you is I am writing a book on small business. It has been a passion of mine for the last 3 decades. And what I'm especially curious in, on the basis of my research, and now I've interviewed 20 or 30 small business owners, is what will President Trump do if elected to stimulate small business? And here's why the question. We talk a lot about employment. 2 of 3 new jobs come from small business. Small business is about 45% of US GDP. And I'm telling you, every federal election, every Republican and Democrat talks about, oh, I love small business, I favor small business. But what I want to do is get a sense from a tax perspective. I hear you on the regulatory perspective, spot on. But from a tax perspective, is there going to be accelerated depreciation? Is there going to be a 1-year bonus, 100% accelerated depreciation? What will a Trump 47 administration look like from a tax perspective for small business from a stimulative effect?
Yeah, so I I think that the 100% expensing for equipment is what for the extension or make permanent the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Job Act. That's 100% on the table, and I actually think a better way than I'm not in love with this 15% tax rate if you build a factory in the U.S. I think that's very difficult to do, and you really blow up every WTO protocol on that. I actually think that we should have a limited life than for structures, where structures are 100%. You can expense those by 100% also. So, I agree with you that I think Wall Street's done great, and somehow, and I look back, I'm 62, so I think when did the Republican Party kind of jettison small business? And I think it was that Tom DeLay crowd during the Enron years. Much easier to walk into Enron, walk out with $10 million of checks, which back in those days was a lot, than do 30 Rotary Club lunches and have that cohort. So I think that's important. I think we have seen in 2005, the top 5 banks controlled 22% of assets. Now they control 50%. So I actually think a renewed commitment to community banking is very important.
Dan, thank you. Appreciate it. Mark Johnson, come on in. Tell folks where you are. If you'd like to say who you're supporting for president, you're welcome to. And tell us what's on your mind.
Hi, I'm from Wellington, Nevada. I did vote for Trump. So I think in regards to the economy, I think it's interesting because from my perspective, out here in the West, we're all hurting with high gas prices, energy prices. I'm a farmer too. So
and by the way, I'm a farmer too. I might not look like it. I'm a top 5 farmer in North Dakota. So I'm a farmer too.
okay, I'm just a little farmer. I grow lavender. I have a small lavender farm out here. But I guess some of my concern is just if you look at the last 4 years, you could see although the stock market has done well, for those of us who are not involved in the stock market, it has been a challenge. So that's a large percentage of the country. Even if you take away the 401ks, those don't come into play. And also those could end up being adjusted in some kind of downfall or something like that in the future. So at 62, like you are, I'm having to take Social Security early just to kind of subsidize what I've lost by changing careers and getting out of the more professional role that I was in my past life. So it's going to be interesting. I think time will tell. And so I think that lowering energy prices is going to be a huge move. And whether it's deregulating or moving into more expansion and more pumping, or, I think that's going to be a huge part of what brings this country back to its strength and what it needs to be. So with that said, or go ahead, if you have a comment.
No, go ahead.
So with that said, Mark, can I bring something up I've wanted to say for a couple of weeks now?
Yes,
Is
sir.
that possible to change the subject? So back in July of 17, I sent you an email, but I think the Democrats really missed the boat. And I think one of the things I've been wanting to get on and say is that when it was apparent that Biden wasn't going to be able to run, I felt that the Democrats should have offered the Supreme Court seat of Sotomayor to Kamala Harris and got her out of this position.
Yep.
And thus allow her to move forward and bring in another party. But I just wanted to bring that up. I've been wanting to say that for a while.
All right,
Mark, I think they missed a really good opportunity.
Yeah,
But
Mark,
anyway, going back to, I'll let you get back to it.
I agree.
Hold on. Go ahead. Yeah.
A big part of the agenda is getting energy prices down, and energy permeates the entire economy. And I will make a combination financial, observational, and political statement. I could not imagine bigger incompetence in terms of we have the economy for the past 2 years has been blessed with this AI boom, which is a gigantic, biggest capex that we've seen since the 90s. At the same time, you are trying to push everyone into this EV mandate. And we have done nothing in terms of increasing baseload capacity. If anything, we've been pushing out baseload. We've done nothing for the electric grid. Electricity prices are up 30%. And it was one side of the ledger not talking to the other.
So I was one of the early, I got into the solar, I started a solar business in California in 2001. And for 10 years, I built semi-large solar plants and wineries, some of the government agencies up here in the Western and Eastern Sierras. And today I am not a proponent of solar and what we've done with it. I was part of the California Solar Initiative and development of that with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And what I've seen happen in renewables was pretty predictable, in the sense that we've put so much energy in what sounds good and what we should be able to do. The renewable portfolio standards being set subjectively before we even had the technology or the ability to get there. And using solar to me is power.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to get other people in. I'm going to give Scott a chance to react on solar and alternatives in general. I'll just say on your other question, it's a great plan, except neither Sotomayor nor Harris were interested. And so there was no
I
way
know.
to do that. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Scott, if you could just respond in general on what you think of renewables as part of the energy economy, all the above idea.
Yeah, look, I think the transition, somehow there's this hostility to natural gas as the bridge form of energy. You know, I have an EV, it's a toy. I always have charging anxiety. I have a hybrid, and I think I filled it up twice a year, but the people at the EPA or within the administration who are in this purity spiral hate hybrids. God bless Toyota for not caving on hybrids.
Yeah, somebody put in the chat, what about nuclear? What do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think it's the most important form. If you look, what are the Chinese doing? The Chinese are going to build 100 coal plants this year, 100, and they're going to build 10 new nuclear plants. And you're seeing the superscalers or the hyperscalers are going into nuclear. We're going to restart 3 Mile Island, and we've got to start with this nuclear permitting. And yeah, I think nuclear is really the way forward. And
Okay.
you know, if you look, I think we probably agree, Bill Gates, Mike Bloomberg are two of the great climate activists, and Bill Gates is throwing a ton of resources into nuclear.
Yep. All right. I've tried to get Chris Simmons in, but his signal's bad, so we'll wait to Chris get to safer ground. And now we're going to go hyper sophisticated here. Tyler Goodspeed, who served in the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump. Tyler, great to see you. We'd love to hear what you want to ask Scott.
Yeah, no, good to see you, Mark. I was just sort of wondering something that I feel hasn't been given enough attention in recent months is the fact that you've had a lot of left-leaning academics, former Democratic alums. Jason Furman is among them. My predecessor as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, who have publicly stated that the Federal Reserve should consider or should raise their inflation target. And a lot of things in economics ultimately are level effects. There's an effect on the rate of change during the process of adjustment, but ultimately in long run steady state, it's a level effect. But when you're talking about changing an inflation target, that is a direct effect on the rate of change permanently. So I'm just wondering, do you think that is a risk in the event of a Harris-Walz win next week, that there could be some risk to the Fed's 2% inflation target?
Well, under the guidance of Lael Brainerd, the Fed adopted an average inflation target, which is, for those of you who have lives and don't delve into these things, it's a makeup provision. So if you undershot target, you could go above target. I am very against, with this amount of debt, I am against changing the target. And the one thing you really shouldn't do, even if you're thinking of changing the target, you've got to get back to your old target before you increase the new target. But sure, they could do it. Jason's a very influential voice. He's rational on some things, he's irrational on others. And we would see who the next Fed chair would be. But I think it'd be a big mistake.
Tyler, thank you. Scott, how would you describe your economic philosophy?
I think that I am orthodox, but willing to admit, or when something isn't working, push for changes. I have, if any of you having trouble sleeping, I have an article in The Economist this week where I talk about the international trading system isn't working. And in my career, my most successful investments have been looking at companies or governments that are going 90 miles an hour at a brick wall and assuming that they are going to slam on brakes before they hit the wall. Occasionally I've been in the car with them when they hit the wall, which isn't pleasant. But I think we are careening toward a serious problem in the international trading system here, because working class people all around the world are growing very wary of what used to be called free trade, and free trade since 1981 has not been fair trade. And you can see it in these big surpluses that are building up, that there's this concept of equivalence, Ricardian equivalence. There's some people are better at making wine, some people are better at making Nikes, but it really doesn't work across national boundaries. And the other thing, I'm probably going to get pummeled in the chat, Donald Trump really is a free trader. He just walking out of the G7 meeting in Ottawa, he said, like, all of you drop your tariffs, I'll drop mine. And I think a lot of what he's doing is escalate to de-escalate. And my goal for his administration would be to save international trade, not end up looking like something that would turn of the century tariffs.
Okay. Chris Simmons is a Harris supporter who lives in Georgia, and he's worked his career very successfully in the private sector. Chris.
So Scott, you mentioned earlier that you taught at Yale. That's a pretty good school. I went to a pretty good one too, called Harvard. So when I was studying there, my professors told us that presidents don't really control inflation, which I frankly really believe. I also noticed that the Wall Street Journal recently said that Trump was more likely to cause inflation in his second term than Harris is. So I'm curious to know whether you agree with my Harvard professors that presidents don't really control inflation, and therefore Biden and Harris shouldn't be taking the heat they're taking for the prices in the grocery store. And secondly, do you agree or disagree with the Wall Street Journal, which said that Trump's more likely to cause inflation now?
Well, I'll have to disagree, because the vice president is president of the Senate, and she cast the deciding vote on the spending bill. So the Congress may control the spending, but she enabled it. So without her, if she voted no, it wouldn't have happened. So she owns it. Secondly, Wall Street Journal was wrong. Under Trump 1.0, they said the same thing. And the Wall Street Journal isn't saying it. It's a survey of the money managers and economists. And look, I think it's absurd to think that Donald Trump is going to cause inflation. We have Trump 1.0 and inflation. And I'm going to be fair. I'm going to leave out 2020, which was a COVID year, which was a shockingly low inflation number, but inflation was very quiescent. It was 2.1%. And I think that we all understand what's going on around the world is this is a revolt by working class people for negative real wage growth. The Prime Minister of Japan just got thrown out. The new Prime Minister, the LDP leader, just got thrashed because the Japanese are seeing negative real wages. So the idea that Donald Trump is going to be inflationary, I believe, is absurd.
Chris,
And
thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, sorry about that. I got to get a couple more folks in before we got to go. Christine, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry, it took me a second there. Hi, Scott. I'm the granddaughter of North Dakota ranchers, so great to hear that you're still active up there too. I am a Harris supporter, but I want to see whoever gets elected, run or help to execute a fantastic U.S. economy. And you may have actually alluded to my question just a minute ago, because the most concerning element of President Trump's proposed economic agenda is related to tariffs. And it's especially what he said on Joe Rogan the other day, which was the idea of replacing federal income tax, with tariff revenue. Is that a concept that you're in support of, or is that something to potentially discuss?
Look, I think a couple of things on tariffs. U.S. has very low tariffs. I think that Joe Rogan said, well, could we get rid of the income tax with tariffs? And I think President Trump said, I'd consider it, or maybe it wasn't. That's the sine qua non for my 2024-2028 agenda. can tariffs supplement and U.S. revenues, and then we could do targeted tax cuts elsewhere? Sure. But I do think at the end of the day, so there are two kinds of tariffs. He's talking about a global 10% tariff. And the way to think about that, it's a one-time price adjustment. Historically, the currency moves up about 40%. So that takes care of part of the price adjustment. We have elasticities and consumer preference. The external manufacturers may take it into their margins. So, I think tariffs have probably been utilized. Again, if people are having trouble sleeping, you can go into Wiki. There's a big section on economic theory, on the optimal theory of tariffs. But I wouldn't worry about the tariffs, because I do think if I have any say, that this time it will be much less abrupt. That I think the 60% tariffs on China are a maximalist negotiating position, and that I don't like forward guidance in monetary policy, but I think you can have forward guidance in tariff policy. And you could tell the Chinese, okay, we're going to 60. It's 2.5% a month for the next 24 months. And then what does that do? It gives financial markets time to calibrate. It gives real economy manufacturers time to calibrate. And it gives Xi Jinping, he can decide when the frog's boiled.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I guess just Mark, real quick, just thinking about trying to replace 2 trillion, in income tax revenue, which pays about 50% of the federal budget, on tariffs on about 3 trillion, I guess, in imports, meaning you'd have to have a pretty high tariff rate in order to replace that.
No.
I hear what you're saying, that it would be a mix.
But if you go back and listen to what President Trump said, it was like, I would consider it. The economy has changed since the McKinley days.
Yeah, Christine, thank you. Scott, you're a dad. What are 2 or 3 keys to being a good parent?
I think there's only one key. I think it's time. Well, 2, time and consistency. That since I started having this second job, I have fought tooth and nail to spend time with my children. I have to block out whole periods, and then I think it's consistency of message, and make sure that they're going where they want to go. I tell my children, look, I taught at Yale. I went to Yale. It will not change my life one way or the other if you go there. If you want to become a farmer, if you want to become an artist, I don't care what you do, just do something.
Yeah. Lastly, you've dabbled in politics before, but this experience is your biggest immersion. What's something that you've learned about American politics or surprised you about either politics or campaigns?
Well, with politics, I think everyone in this call, people on the outside care about good outcomes. We are all pushing for good outcome. Everyone who asks me a question expects that we want a good outcome. I have now, and I've also taught game theory classes and studied game theory a lot. So I was surprised how naive I was. I can barely talk to my other investment friends about politics, because they have a view on what should happen, not what's going to happen. And so it is that politicians will do things for power over good outcomes very often.
Yeah.
And and it could be their personal power.
Yeah, a couple times at least, President Trump has called you up to speak at his rallies. What is that experience like?
Well, it's startling, because I never know that it's going to happen. It actually, he calls me out. I've only been up once. It was in Asheville, North Carolina, and all my friends in New York wouldn't believe. They said, "Oh, you knew he was going to call you up," and I said, "No, I actually didn't." They said, "Well, you were the only person in the arena wearing a suit." And I said, well, A, it's Western North Carolina, and B, when you're around Donald Trump, you always wear a suit.
I thought you'd been up twice. My error. Very grateful to you for making time to come talk. And again, I'd love for you to come back. Let's say President Trump wins. If you can time during the transition, we'd love for you to come back. And as I said, you're generous to make time. It's such a busy time for you. So thank you.
Good. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. All right. I appreciate everyone who had questions tonight. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., Sean Dan and I will be back for the morning meeting. And then we're back to the regular time tomorrow, 6 Eastern time. We were special tonight because I have to spend time with my son's teachers at school night. So I'm leaving now for that. Tomorrow, regular time, 6 o'clock with another special guest, happens to be another person associated with the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort. So come with your questions for that. Grateful to everybody again who participated, Tyler and Chris and Christine and everybody else. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Have a great night.